G'day, this episode of the Oracle Mobile Application Framework online training is dedicated to discussing one of the reusable features that is built into MAF pages to save you repetitive page layouts known as fragments. Imagine you have a HR application where you first search for an employee, then over several pages in a feature, you manage the employee, maybe investigating their payroll data, who they report to, what their employment history is. On each page, to make sure you don't lose context, the application at the top of the screen presents the employee's details, such as their picture, their name and position. This helps you as a user know who you're working with without having to navigate backward and forward screens to see the appropriate employee's data. Now imagine on each page those contextual details, the mugshot, the name and position. Sometimes you put the picture on the left, sometimes the position and the name on the left, sometimes you put the positions on the right. Each page the fields tend to get muddled up depending on what the developer did. Ideally the developer wouldn't make this mistake, but they have lots of screens to develop, lots of things to get right, and I guess it's understandable that some UI issues sneak in. Can we do better than this? Can MAF provide some sort of templating mechanism for pages that allows us to create an overall page template to lay out components again and again across pages? Or even a more fine-grained template for different parts of the screen that the developer can use to get a consistent look and feel. Imagine the time and development effort we could remove or solve if we had a feature like this. This is where MAF fragments come in. A fragment is a build-your-own supercomponent where you compose the fragment out of other AMX components. Once you have this, you can then use the fragment across different pages in your application. I like to think of this as stamping the fragment across different pages in your application. The advantage being you get consistent look and feel across the application. You improve developer productivity as the fragment has already done much of the work, and especially from a maintenance perspective, if you want to change the layout of the fragment, for example, it only needs to be done in one place in the fragment, not on numerous separate pages if you weren't using the fragment. Let's build a very simple fragment to increase your understanding by first discussing what we want to build, then looking at a demo in JDeveloper of how to build the fragment. What you see here is a very simple fragment that I want to build for my application. As our HR application is all about employees, their details, and wanting to contact them, I predict that the application will have lots of places where we want to allow the user to invoke the device's email program to email the current employee they're looking at. To make it very obvious that the employee can be emailed, we want to standardize on the look and feel of the email facility across our application with this envelope icon on the left and the hyperlink using a Go link to show the employee's name to the right. As the icon is on the left and the link is on the right, the fragment will need to use a horizontal panel group layout to lay out these components. In terms of a fragment, the components which we want to replicate across pages, the image, link and panel group layout in this example, are the static content of the fragment. That is the content that will not change regardless of wherever it's used. But we don't want all the content to be static. Now, not everyone is going to want to email Chris Muir, surprising as that seems. So the fragment requires dynamic content, that is, content that will be injected by the consumer of the fragment. Fragments support dynamic content via attributes and facets. An attribute is just a named variable that is referred to in a property of the static content of our fragment. So for example, rather than hard-coding Chris Muir into the text of the AMX Go link, we could make this an attribute of the fragment known as person name, and another attribute, email address, for which email address to use when emailing the person. The second type of dynamic content for a fragment is known as a facet, as we mentioned earlier. A facet allows the caller to inject any components into a named location in the fragment. In other words, a named facet. This gives the consumer of the fragment a fair amount of flexibility of what to inject. An image, some text, some combination of other components, but also ensures the fragment still has a standardized look and feel because the fragment determines where the facet and the injected components are located in the overall fragment. This is awfully handy for our example, as our application will be used in Germany and France, where you're not allowed to email employees after hours. So what we're going to do is include a name facet end, which will allow a developer who uses the email fragment to inject additional components such as an image of a clock to remind us to not contact the German and French employees after 5 p.m. With this example in mind, and the understanding that a fragment is made up of static content with injected attributes and facets, let's demo how you build this fragment and then consume it. In a View Controller project, via the right-click New from Gallery option, we select the Mobile Application Framework Node option, then the MAF AMX Page Fragment option. In the resulting Create MAF AMX Page Fragment dialog, we'll call the fragment email.amxf, amxf being the extension for a fragment. In the resulting source code, you can see the empty fragment file ready to go, made up of a fragment def tag, then the actual fragment tag itself. The easiest way to proceed from here is to build the source code using the structure window. We can add a description tag like this to the fragment, then in the property inspector actually define the text for the description. Next, again from the structure window, we'll add our first attribute. And as you can see, this adds tags for the attribute name and type ready for you to fill out. When defining attributes of a fragment, it's mandatory that you define a name and the Java type for that attribute. Optional definitions on the attribute include a description, a default value if the developer doesn't supply a value for the attribute at runtime, and if a value for the attribute is mandatory. The default value and required settings are mutually exclusive. It's worth noting the order of these tags for the attribute is strictly defined. You cannot reorder them. You are also allowed to include more than one attribute simply by including the attribute tag again. Returning to our demo, moving on from where we left off, I've further expanded our example to include two attributes. The first is called person name and the second is email address. In both cases, they accepted Java lang strings. We've also given the person name a default value and made the email address mandatory. We now want to define a facet for our fragment, and again we can do this via the structure window. We'll call our facet end. From here we want to define the static content of our fragment. I'm going to cheat and copy some code in here which contains, amongst other content, a GoLink parameter that accepts dynamically by the fragment consumer values for the email address and person name to derive the URL and text properties of the GoLink dynamically at runtime. The final thing we need to do in our fragment is define where the content of the end facet will go in our static content. So here we place a facet ref tag for the end facet. Great, so at this time we've defined the fragment, so now let's look at how you make use of it. Here we have a page entitled demo.amx where we'd like to consume the fragment, or in other words, embed the fragment into the page. To do this, we literally drag and drop the fragment from the application navigator into the demo.amx's page source code. On doing so, the IDE is smart enough to interrogate the fragment email.amxf file and realize that the fragment requires, well, in our example, two parameters. So this dialog, when presented, gives you the opportunity to supply values for these attributes, either hard-coded values or EL expressions. Note that the default value we specified for the person name is displaying, and in turn the email address attribute has a star to indicate it requires a value. For purposes of the demonstration, we'll enter some hard-coded text for both parameters. Once we've completed the dialog, now note the new tag fragment added to our demo.amxf page that references our fragment. In addition, we can see both attributes and the values supplied and the facet which is currently empty. Very simply, we'll add an image to display in the facet. There you go. We now understand the need for fragments, how we create them and how we consume them. So you should find them a very valuable inclusion in your MAF applications. Thanks for your time today.